Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us on today's webinar, 5 Actionable Strategies to Embed Diversity and Inclusion Across Your Enterprise, with Claude Warder, SVP and Principal HCM Analyst at Brandon Hall Group, Steve Fayer, Director of Product Marketing at Eightfold, and Ashish Mitarata, Vice President and Principal Talent Transformation at Eightfold. Ashish is a business leader with extensive experience in sales, operations, and HR. Having led global talent acquisition assignments in Tata Communications and Wipro Digital, he has been instrumental in design and implementation of the digital HR experience. With the help of advanced technologies like Eightfold in the HR space, he has managed leadership roles in the HR functions for renowned multinational organizations, including Nokia and Genpact. I would like to extend a thank you to Eightfold for sponsoring today's webinar. Eightfold is an AI company based in Silicon Valley, working with enterprises across industries and around the world. The company uses artificial intelligence technology to transform how enterprises manage their talent throughout the talent lifecycle, from recruiting and hiring through employee mobility, retention, and skills development. The company's AI approach is also designed to prevent bias and support diversity. This AI approach is transformative because it helps companies to think about talent differently. The ability to deliver on human potential with AI requires real expertise in artificial intelligence. Eightfold's founding team are the world experts and are at the cutting edge of delivering business-ready AI. In order to achieve the best results with technology, you need to have the best technology. That is what the Eightfold team is delivering to companies today. I wanted to also share a little bit about Brandon Hall Group. Brandon Hall Group is a research and analyst firm that empowers excellence in organizations around the world through our research and tools. Our vision is to inspire a better workplace experience. We have world-class research, data, expertise across all areas in human capital management. Currently, we have open surveys in Diversity and Inclusion Part 1, Benchmarking, Diversity and Inclusion Part 2, What's Changing, Performance Management, and Talent Management Maturity. We would love to hear from you. In exchange, you could receive a gift card, free research reports, and more. To participate, please visit our website, www.brandonhall.com, and click on Open Surveys. And finally, a few housekeeping items. This presentation is being recorded. The playback will be provided to everyone within 24 hours of the webinar in a follow-up email. If you'd like to ask a question, please do so by typing into the questions box for our presenters. If you would like to download a copy of the presentation instantly, you may find it in the handout section. And now let's turn it over to Claude so we can get started.
Well, thank you, Danny, and thank you to Eightfold and Steve and Ashish for being here, and thanks especially to everyone in the audience for taking the time to watch and listen to us today. I want to get started by just level setting before we drive into all the strategies, really level setting on our language around diversity, equity, and inclusion. You may define them a little bit differently than we do, and we hope you'll share any feedback or different ways of thinking about them. We're all, learning here, and all feedback helps us build our knowledge and understanding. So when we speak of diversity, we're referencing any dimension that can be used to differentiate groups of individuals from one another. The dimensions include, but aren't restricted to, gender, religion, sexual orientation, race, ethnicity, class, education, age, and disability. Now we see equity as the promotion and practice of justice by institutions or systems. Promoting equity requires an understanding of the root causes of outcome disparities within our society. And then inclusion puts the concept and practice of diversity into action by creating an environment where the richness of ideas, backgrounds, and perspectives is harnessed to create business and societal value. Inclusion within an organization or workplace creates a sense of belonging, a feeling that everyone is full members of the community, no matter their background. Inclusion also is linked to a feeling of psychological safety that allows, in the workplace setting, employees to bring their true and complete selves to work. Now I'll turn it over to Steve for a little bit more.
Well, Claude, thank you so much. And thank you, everyone, for spending some time with us today, wherever you are in the world. Today, the benefits of strong diversity, equity, and inclusion programs have been known for a very long time. Surveys have found for quite a few years that the most diverse and inclusive organizations outperform on measures such as profitability and brand value. And in fact, according to research from McKinsey and Company that's taken place over the course of years, these trends are only accelerating. The benefits of DE&I are growing. Yet despite these clear business benefits, organizations just haven't made enough progress. I think if you thought that there had been enough progress, frankly, you wouldn't be joining us today. So that's why we're coming to you with several concrete and actionable ways that you can create more effective DE&I programs and finally move the needle. Before jumping into some more about these programs, I do want to share some findings that illustrate just how important DE&I programs are. This is some new research from Eightfold.ai. But before doing that, I do want to make one important note about language. As part of our commitment to inclusion, we are attempting today to use inclusive language wherever possible, because this language expresses our intent to create workplaces where everyone feels welcome. But now this language in some cases is new. So if you hear any of us use a phrase or term today that you believe is not inclusive, is not your preferred terminology, please let us know. Please enter a note as a question in the Q&A window and let us know where you would like to see us do better. And I thank you in advance for your gift of feedback on that front. So let's look at some new findings. At Eightfold.ai, as Danny introduced us, we're an AI company, and we have a very large database of more than 1 billion talent profiles. So rather than do a survey, we thought, why don't we analyze that data set to get a sense of the current state of organizational diversity? And we looked at the talent data we have for the United States, which overall is more than 90 million profiles, a majority of the workforce. Our AI understands this data and understands the relative seniority level of each person. So with this information, we looked at seniority of the workforce by gender. So what this data is showing you, what this chart is showing you here today, is what share of the workforce is female at each seniority level. I should rephrase that. Of the share of the workforce that's female, what share is at each seniority level? And we see the same data for the workforce that is not female. So with this information, even if the total number of individuals who are female and not female in the workforce are different, we can get a side-by-side comparison. And so what we see here is very striking. Even though organizations have been making efforts to increase gender diversity at the point of hiring, they're still struggling with inclusion on the basis of gender. And we can see this very clearly because of how the representation in the workforce by gender changes as you head up the career ladder. The share of the workforce that's female is relatively overrepresented at the entry and mid-level. But then when you move up into manager and director levels, you have a little bit less female representation. By the time you reach the vice president level, female workers are only half as likely to be a vice president. And at the C-level, representation is just 1/3 as great for female workers. So this may not surprise you, but hopefully it's motivating to see these numbers so starkly, because this is it. This is the U.S. workforce. And these numbers show exactly why inclusion is so important. Because without inclusive policies and practices, female workers are being hired, but they're not being able to realize the full potential to become senior leaders. So this is why we need to talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion. Not just one thing, but all three. Diversity is important because we need to consider all dimensions of diversity, as Claude explained a few minutes ago. We do have data that can show similar things for other dimensions of diversity. And equity is important because when we see these kinds of results, we need programs to actively change these results. We can't just wait around and expect that the situation will improve on its own. Frankly, we've been waiting a long time, and the time for action is now. And inclusion is important, finally, because hiring people from underrepresented groups isn't enough if those individuals won't be able to become managers and vice presidents and even CEOs someday. We know that there's a stat that only 3 CEOs in the US Fortune 500 are Black, which is frankly appalling. We can do better. Our intentions and words are very important, but they can't take the place of action. And that's why we need to embed actions in our organizations, so that the outcomes don't depend on the presence of one person or on the attention of the media. We need to be able to still do the right thing even if the attention is off. We need to make DE&I the default rather than the exception. So why are certain groups of individuals underrepresented in the first place? Why are underrepresented groups underrepresented? And the reason why, broadly speaking, is bias. Bias can mean a lot of things, but for our purposes, we mean any decision-making tendency that has the effect of impacting one group over another, again, as Claude has explained earlier. So for example, if we see that a larger share of people living with disabilities are not being hired compared to, then that would be an example of bias. If we see, as we have, that female people in the workforce are not being promoted, that would be an example of bias. And so that's why it's so important we make preventing bias the default mode. So to help set up the strategies we're going to explain today, I want to look at bias across the career journey. And we see here 4 steps on the career journey. This omits a lot of complexity. There's many more steps in the career journey. Certainly, please define those steps, additional steps in your process. But we want to focus on these steps because, number one, they are very important sources of bias in particular. And number two, we can impact them with the strategies we're sharing today. So first, let's consider candidacy, the candidate experience. And from that very first moment when somebody encounters your company and thinks about working there, from that very first moment, we see a bias against underrepresented groups. And in particular, there's 2 reasons why. Number one, as has been well known and discussed, is that job descriptions use biased language, which can especially discourage female candidates and older candidates. And the simple fact that applying takes so much time can also have a disparate impact, in particular on busy working parents. Now, once someone applies and they become an applicant, you get into the hiring process. And again, there's major opportunities for bias because recruiters and hiring managers, often without intending to, can make decisions based on gender, race, age, and other personal characteristics, which do not impact whether someone is going to be the right person for the job. So let's skip ahead just a little bit in the career journey to think about training and mentorship. After someone's been hired, they're doing their job, and they're looking for opportunities to grow and learn. Well, what will that person learn? What opportunities will be made available to them? There are many factors that actually can contribute to bias in training programs, but I want to highlight one in particular, which is that training opportunities are often offered to people based on the jobs they have today. And this is going to create major opportunities for bias because workers who are in certain roles getting certain training opportunities will not have the same range of opportunity as other workers, which is especially important if those different parts of the workforce have different representation. With mentorship, we see yet another hurdle because employees can benefit from mentors other than their direct manager. But if employees need to find mentors on their own, they have to network. And that can take time away. And that disfavors those busy working parents who may not have time. Meanwhile, the employees who come from privileged backgrounds, they maybe went to fancy schools, they're going to have time to go seek out influential mentors and have a leg up in finding that opportunity. Employee resource groups are designed to help address these issues, but then you're coming back to having your improvement in your inclusion in the workforce depend on individual people rather than embedding the process in the company. The last point I want to highlight is internal mobility, the process of looking for another job within the company. And eventually, every employee should have that opportunity. But again, there's biases because people have been tracked to roles and they may not have the ability to look outside their current role to find new opportunities. Even the fact that employees often need to ask or have that conversation around what's next in a stressful conversation, maybe a performance review with their manager, or in a conversation with an HR person they've never met before. These are processes that disfavor underrepresented groups and hold them back from advancing in the company. So these are some examples where bias has such a pervasive impact. But we can do better. If we look at what should happen instead, we can see an outcome that we would want to get toward. If at the point of candidacy, for example, at that very first interaction with the candidate, what if instead you encourage each candidate to apply for the right job and make it fast? That will reduce the opportunity for bias in candidacy. And if in the hiring process you focus instead on what each candidate can do rather than any other factor, again, you can remove the bias from the hiring process to the greatest extent possible. Within the organization, in terms of training and mentorship, a better model is to manage those processes centrally and to personalize the offer to the individuals, which removes opportunities for advantage based on individuals' background and removes opportunities for disadvantage because somebody may not have experience in the organization. Finally, with internal mobility, in some sense, the right approach is a culmination of what we have with these first three steps. You want to encourage internal growth and make it based on what each person could be doing based on their capabilities and potential. You're going to be doing these things so that you can remove both self-selection bias and other biases that can get in the way if the internal mobility process is gated by managers or gated by networking or other factors which are not a level playing field. So this, in short, is the fair approach that we want to get us toward. And that's what our strategies today are designed to do. In order to reach these kinds of outcomes, we can employ these 5 strategies. To remove bias in the candidate experience, build that candidate experience based on the capabilities of each person. To remove bias from the hiring process, use anonymous screening. To remove bias from the employee advancement processes, including training, mentorship, and internal mobility, base that career advancement on processes that are self-service and, like the candidate experience, are based on capabilities and are transparent as well. Across all of these steps, you need to be measuring diversity in real time so that you can take corrective action and measure the impact of the actions that you are taking, including equity policy. And finally, you want to employ approaches, policies, and tools so that preventing bias does become the default mode of your organization. So we're going to dive into each of these strategies one at a time and spend some time on them, including sharing a few case studies today. As we go through, we do want to hear your questions, so please do send us your questions, and we will save time at the end to address them. But at this point, I'd like to hand the virtual microphone back to Claude to discuss deploying organization-wide approaches, policies, and tools. All right, Claude, take it away.
All right, thanks, Steve. Yeah, so this first one is really a foundational strategy on which a lot of the other actionable specific strategies that Steve and Ashish are talking about today can really be implemented. A lot of this has to be in place for a lot of the other things to happen, and you really have to understand where you are at an organization, address it at this foundational level. So, despite all the data Steve just shared about how some organizations are struggling with diversity, equity, inclusion, our research shows that the vast majority of organizations believe, that DE&I are very important business drivers, and also more than 80% of organizations believe that they are in fact diverse and inclusive. So in other words, in many organizations, mission is already accomplished if you ask them if they're diverse and inclusive. So there's really a pretty large gap between employers' intentions and their perceptions around diversity, equity, inclusion, and the reality that some of our data will show here and that Steve has already pointed out. This reveals a lack of understanding of how to build diversity, equity, inclusion across an enterprise on an ongoing basis. So that said, during the COVID-19 pandemic is an illustration of what organizations are capable of. During this crisis, the majority of organizations have done a very good job of demonstrating inclusive leadership behaviors, according to our research. This data comes from our ongoing research on COVID-19 between April and August. In this crisis situation, most organizations, the majority, understood that they needed to focus on employee well-being. They needed to persevere in the face of challenges. They needed to show empathy to their colleagues and team members, work to build trust, and collaborate and work to influence and inspire others. So this is clear that organizations understand what's needed to build inclusion, but many just have not been able to leverage that understanding in a comprehensive way over a period of time because not all the building blocks are in place to really do that on an enterprise level. So move to the next slide. In our annual DE&I research, we looked at the environment, the DE&I environment over a longer period of time. And we see that the majority of organizations struggle to build diversity and inclusion in meaningful ways across the organization. So for instance, this data shows that only between 34% and 44% of organizations believe their workforce reflects the composition of their communities or their customer base, or that they effectively address pay equity by gender, race, or ethnicity. Even fewer organizations on the next slide believe they do a good job of building a diverse talent pipeline, a diverse leadership group, or being transparent about retention of diverse employee populations. So as I said, this represents a disconnect between how organizations perceive themselves and the behaviors and strategies that really demonstrate diversity, equity, and inclusion. This doesn't mean organizations are insincere by any means. It means that they just haven't been able to create that foundation so that they can evolve their enterprise-wide approaches and policies to effectively drive long-term results. So to do that, to be successful, particularly in building inclusion across the organization, employers need to take kind of a four-pronged approach. First, you need to build consistent strategies and policies throughout the organization. So you have to focus on the organization as a whole. Then you have to ensure that experiences are personalized and contextualized enough so that they can have an impact on individual employees. Then you need to establish programs, a programmatic factor in your organization to hire a diverse workforce and create targeted development of diverse employee populations to ensure equity and career opportunities. And then finally, create systems to facilitate DE&I. This includes certainly technology, as we'll discuss, governance, including creating DEI councils to manage efforts across the enterprise, and establishing employee resource groups and other methods of involving employees at all levels of the organization. Everything has to work together, in other words. And then these more specific strategies that Steve and Ashish are going to talk about can bubble up from there and really drive results. So to illustrate in a little bit more detail what this looks like, here is our Brandon Hall Group's diversity and inclusion framework. I'm just going to talk to it at a high level. In the center is the goal, the end goal, right? Which is to drive business growth. And to do that, organizations must do the things that are in the circle around the nucleus there, which is instilling values, having a talent strategy, building a culture of continuous learning, and drive employee engagement and retention through recognition and employee activism. And then surrounding the circle are things like technology, which we're going to drill down on, and the overall organizational culture, governance, and continuous measurement of results, making adjustments as needed. And then the boxes at right, which we call our success levers, just simply indicate the many factors, many of them external, that influence everything. This includes events like have been going on in society, like the social justice movement, as well as the support of leadership, as well as commitment of stakeholders across the organization, strategic alignment, and other things. And so this is not an easy journey, and there's a lot to do, and everyone in every organization is at a different place, needs to develop at their own pace. So before we delve into some of these other strategies, we wanted to kind of get a sense after kind of laying the framework here, of where all of you are in your organizations, in your journeys. So we wanted to do a quick poll with you. We'll have a couple of other polls as well in a few minutes. This question is simply, where is your organization in its DE&I journey? Please select the answer that best matches your current situation. Is it A, we're just getting started? Or B, we had strong intentions without much strategy? C, we had engagement across the organization? Or D, we're seeing business impact, real business impact from our efforts? So getting a sense of where you are helps us as we continue to produce content, and it will also even help us in the context of our conversation today as we have a better understanding of where you are in your journey. So Danny, let us know when you've got some responses. So it looks like about a quarter are just getting started, and another 44% have really strong intentions without much strategy. So that's about 2/3 of you are really at the beginning pieces of your journey. And so I think there's a lot of things here that Steve and Ashish are going to talk about that can really help. And then it's great to see that a little over a quarter have engagement across the organization. They're making good progress. And then, like the great majority of organizations, you're not yet, only a very small percentage are really seeing business impact. So that's really where we're hoping to go, is to get you whichever the three lower levels you're at, to get you to move forward and help you in your journey. So let's continue on, Steve, with strategy number 2.
Well, thank you, Claude. And absolutely, only 3% of you are seeing business impacts from your efforts. The next strategies we'll show you how you can start to get those impacts. And the second strategy we want to talk about is taking it back to the candidate experience specifically and focusing that candidate experience on what each person can do. In other words, what each person's capabilities are. And the way to do this is to focus that candidate experience on the candidate. Make your career site focused on the candidate. That means when your candidate comes to the career site, they should see information personalized for them. And I don't just mean at a surface level, like, welcome back, Steve. Thank you for returning to our site. Because the most important question any career site visitor has is, what jobs are available? Which jobs should I apply for? And you want to answer that question as well as possible and as quickly as possible. So with the candidate-focused career site, all of your available jobs will be ranked for that person so that they can see the jobs that they're best fit for. And they can see exactly why. Which of their skills and experiences give them the capability to do that job well, and for which the company will consider their candidacy very strongly. This is what we see here in this image on the right, an example of a candidate coming to a career site, seeing a job, and seeing exactly why they're a match. And this experience becomes very encouraging because it shows each person why they're a great candidate, which reduces that self-selection bias, which often exists today when people have to read job descriptions and interpret. And it reduces some of this feeling of risk in applying for a job. So making a candidate focused is very important, but there's one other factor, which is making it fast to apply as well, making it easy to apply. And today, this is often not the approach that organizations take. You should consider if this may be your organization, right? Some organizations want candidates to jump through a few hoops because they think, well, if we get too many applications, we can't handle them. So I'd like my candidates to fill out a long form, take an assessment test, write a cover letter, and so forth. But that logic is backwards, I have to tell you. Because if you do that, you're driving off diverse talent. You're driving off people who especially may struggle to take the time. Busy parents, older workers who are going to be turned off by that difficult application process. So making it easy to apply will improve the diversity profile of your applicants across several dimensions. And by the way, if you're worried that making it easy is going to increase the number of applications, which creates another issue for you, there are lots of tools today that can help you automatically screen your candidates, especially with artificial intelligence, so that even if you get more applications, you can actually screen them faster. Now, at Eightfold, one of our candidates looked into the impact of using a highly efficient career site that minimizes clicks and personalizes for each candidate. This is not really a case study, more of just a stat, but what they found is this. Their old career site required a minimum of 182 clicks. When they moved to an Eightfold career site that was designed to be easy, it only took 11 clicks. So this is the kind of change you want to be thinking about. If you make it easy, if you reduce the barriers to applying, you'll improve your diversity of your candidates. So that's strategy number 2 today. Strategy number 3 we want to jump to is called anonymous screening. And anonymous screening will stop much of the opportunity for selection bias during the hiring process in terms of who is selected for each further stage in the hiring process. Now, with anonymous screening, the hiring manager won't see any personal information about the candidate. They're not going to see any evidence of their age, gender, race, or education. This information could also be hid from the recruiter as well. At Eightfold, we see that in most cases, companies want to hide it from the hiring manager, but not from the recruiter. And when that information is hidden, you see about what you see here on the right side. The top is an example of a fully visible profile. The bottom is an example of that profile, which has been anonymized. I do want to note, by the way, that this is not a new concept. Technology, though, makes it easy. This process has often been called candidate masking. It's also often been called blind screening, but we prefer anonymous screening as the more inclusive term. And frankly, I think it should become standard for all large organizations. So if you're not doing this, this is something you can put into place today. Brandon Hall Group had shared some research during the course of preparing for this webinar that showed that only 16% of organizations are doing this today. And I do want to now bring in my colleague Ashish, who as a practitioner has employed anonymous screening and seen the results. So Ashish, over to you. Please let us know what you were able to do.
Hey, thank you, Steve and Claude. Friends on the call, it's wonderful to have you here and talk about some of the learnings that I've had over the past several years, at least more than 3 years that I've been using Eightfold as a platform. And I do remember very clearly about 2.5 years back when we had put this requirement in front of Eightfold that we really want to eliminate bias from the screening process. And this was clearly a mandate of the CEO and the CHRO of the company I used to work for then. You know, they were able to develop this platform in about just 3 weeks, and we had the masking process running on the ground. So this has been out there for a while, and it's proven and tested. Now, we promised you in the beginning that this webinar will be about actionable strategies. And here is a ground level view. Let's track diversity through the hiring process to see if we can do something to firstly identify if there is bias. And then, well, if you find bias, how do you address it? How do you address those concerns, right? Now, there are broadly 6 steps in the hiring process that we are looking at, as on the screen: sourcing, recruiter screen, then hiring manager screen. That's where the CV is masked typically. And then there are the couple of rounds of business interviews, and the candidate is offered and joins. Now let's look at the graph which is coming up on this page. Steve, may I? Yeah, thank you. So this data that you see are just numbers which are indicative, right? And we just want to provoke your thoughts around this. Now, imagine if you are in the HR head of the company who's looking at this data, and you notice that at the sourcing stage, the diversity is at 20% of the overall population. That means, let's say out of 10,000 resumes which have been sourced by the company, only about 2,000 are for diverse profiles. But okay, fortunately, during the recruiter screening and hiring manager screening, this number improves and goes up to 24. And when you look at data more closely, you will notice at the L1 interview stage, there is again a dip, which we are highlighting for you. And towards the end, when the L2 interviews have happened and the folks have been offered and joined, the diversity has improved, right? Now, at this stage, if you are the CHRO of that company, you would definitely want to know that, folks, what is not working at the sourcing stage as well as the L1 interview stage. Why is there a dip at these stages? So what we have for you now are questions on a poll. Look at the first problem statement, which is number one, diversity seems to be low at the sourcing stage. And what, in your opinion, are possible solutions, right? Number one, enhancing diversity through various sourcing channels like referrals, LinkedIn, agencies, etc. Or you could look at incentivizing and applauding recruiters and perhaps even business leaders who have achieved well. Thirdly, could you think of strengthening your campus strategy and enhance diversity? Lastly, all of the above. So it's over to you. Give it a deep thought, wear the hat of your CHRO, and share your feedback, please. Well, 94% people are saying all of the above, right? And uh, strengthening campus definitely is one way. Enhancing through all the sourcing channels is also a way. But clearly, if we go for all the above together in one shot, we would have addressed the issue of having a small or a problematic sourcing pipeline in the first place. Coming to question number two. So there is perhaps a bias, right, at an L1 interview stage. All right. So I'm just putting a clause over there. Is there a bias? Diversity is dropping after the L1 interviews have happened. What are the possible symptoms? Think about it. There could be bias in the L1 stage, but we need to have more data. You have to perhaps look in deeply and figure out which business units or even which business managers seem to be contributing. And do you see a trend? Second, quality of screening by the recruiters needs to be reviewed. Are recruiters just pumping in numbers, just to make their own data look good, while the candidates need to be really deserving? And thirdly, do we have the sufficient enough candidate pool? Lastly, all of the above. Again, from the hat of a CHRO. Awesome. Awesome. So all the answers are right. And if suppose you were the one that said all the above, then you've got all of them right, right? So if I was, for example, the CHRO, I would want to look at all these areas being addressed simultaneously, right? And figure out which can really pull the plug, to improve things. Lastly, uh, can we look at the last page, please? Great. Now, there was a picture over here, I thought, and the picture is, now you see a significant uptick on diversity at the joiner stage. It was showing a good 28%. So what does it tell you? It says clearly a huge and a positive inclination towards enhancing diversity. That means the management has done a great job. The leadership has done a great job in terms of communicating to the business managers that diversity is important to the success of the company. Then there are opportunities that need closer attention to improving diversity. We just saw with the previous couple of examples that what can data and analysis do to help solve such problems. Lastly, looking at your data dashboards for change management, right? And change management could mean a whole lot of things. Some of them have been covered in the previous pages, and some are coming up now. Steve, over to you, my friend.
Well, thank you so much, Ashish. And thank you, everyone, for answering these questions and engaging. As we keep going, we'll start taking your questions here in about 11 minutes. So please do send us your questions and topics for further discussion for the end of our webinar. But to pick up where Ashish left off, leveraging data and dashboards is very critical. And this is our fourth strategy today: measuring and correcting, and critically, in as close to real time as feasible with your technology today. Oh, we seem to have gone backwards. Excuse me. All right, measuring and correcting in real time. So this is the next strategy we want to look at, looking at analytics to find and root out potential bias in the hiring process. Now, even with anonymous screening, there are still opportunities and still potential for hiring bias to exist. Because let's think about it. Even though the hiring manager with anonymous screening is going to pick people to interview based on their capabilities, they're still going to meet the candidate. So they're still eventually going to make some judgment call about that candidate's personal characteristics, such as their age and gender. And that's just part of the reality of being human. We see somebody and we're going to detect what we believe is their age, their gender, their race, and so forth. We can't not detect that. Hopefully, though, we're not going to let that affect our decision making. But there is still opportunity for bias to enter the hiring process, and that's where diversity analytics can come in. So what these analytics can show you is the hiring funnel for each stage and for each diversity category. So we see an example here on the right of what this can look like, and we see 5 representative stages. It doesn't matter if you use 6 as Ashish's prior company or any other number of stages. You still look at this progression the same way. And we also see some different diversity categories as well. We happen to have U.S. equal opportunity categories here, but again, you can use different categories that matter to your business. What these analytics will do is for each category and each stage, show if there is a statistically significant bias. So let me explain what I mean by statistically significant bias, because this is the real key here. So suppose, for example, that 10% of your applicants are coming from an underrepresented group. That would suggest, knowing nothing else, that perhaps 10% of the people you hire should also be members of that group. After all, 10% applicants, 10% hire. That seems roughly fair, but that's also an approximation. Now, what if you have 9% of your hiring from that group instead of 10% applied, 9% hired? Well, that's a small difference. Maybe that's due to chance, depending on the overall number we're talking about. But what if you find that it's only 1% being hired from that group? Well, 1% is very different from 10%, and that would be statistically significant. There is very little chance that random chance is the reason why 1% were hired when 10% applied. And that's what these analytics are going to find. Not only the difference, but exactly where in the process that discrepancy took place. And then you, as an organizational leader, can go investigate why that discrepancy took place. Now, there can be several causes, right? First of all, depending on the level of statistical significance, maybe it's just a coincidence, random chance, and that can happen. But it is unlikely, right? If you have a penny at your desk, you can go ahead and start flipping that penny. I have one right here. And sometimes you'll get heads, sometimes you'll get tails. But you're not likely to get heads 20 times in a row. You could get heads 20 times in a row, but if you keep flipping that penny from now until the end of the year 2020, you are not going to get heads 20 times in a row. The chances of that happening are really unlikely. So most likely your investigation is going to find some reason why this discrepancy is occurring. And in many cases, unfortunately, the reason is going to be a person. Someone is making biased decisions. And it may be unintentional. They may need training. It may mean that you need to move that person into a different role or out of the company altogether, depending on the severity of the issue. But now you've been able to find it so that you can take action. Now, you may also find some other systemic cause. Maybe there is some step in the process which is driving out the candidates who you want to encourage. Perhaps, for example, you have some assessment which is turning off a certain group of your applicants compared to the other applicants. That may suggest that you need to change that part of your hiring process. And with these analytics, you can find that. But there's one other important factor here, which comes back to equity. I'm using as a hypothetical here that 10% of your applicants are members of an underrepresented group. But you as an organization may decide, you know, this is a group which represents 25% of our community. We as an organization want to represent our community. So we want to be hiring 25% of our total hires as from members of this underrepresented group. That's our goal, regardless of who's applying. So you've decided, in other words, that you need an equity policy. And that's exactly where diversity analytics can also come into play, because you can measure the impact of those equity policies and make sure that you're having the outcome that you're looking for. Now, one of the ways that we talk about equity policies in the United States is affirmative action. It's not exactly a synonym for equity, but it is a term for a certain type of equity policy. And it's way above my pay grade. It's way beyond the scope of this webinar today to say what equity policies are right for you and your organization, because that's an extremely complex topic and extremely serious. You need to make that choice based on many factors, such as your local laws and regulations, the history of your organization and the history of your society and country. You need to look at the expectations of your community and your customers, and more factors. So there are a lot that comes into deciding what equity policies to pursue. But what you need to think about, and what I can tell you need to do, is measure the impact of those policies and measure them in real time. Because you need to know if that policy is having the intended effect. And not only that, you need to know if there are any unintended side effects of the policy that are also occurring. And that's what these analytics can do for you. I want to compare this, the way of thinking about this, I want to compare this to something that maybe we're all thinking about right now, which is clinical trials for medicines. A medicine or a vaccine goes through a clinical trial to determine whether it's safe and whether it's effective. We don't just trust that it's going to work because we think it should work. Scientists are very smart. Look, some scientists, they've done a protein folding experiment on their supercomputer, and they've given the medicine to rhesus monkeys and guinea pigs, and it seems to work and seems to be safe based on that. But that's not the same as real life. You need to test it in real life, and that's exactly what these kinds of analytics will do. They give you the ability to measure a clinical trial for equity policy so that if it's working really well, you can put that policy into place quickly. And if there are unintended side effects, you can find out right away and address those side effects or look for a different policy that will work better for you. This way, you're not going to be waiting years to see if your policy is going to work. I know we have an example to share here, so I want to turn it back to Ashish to talk about a program that he's put into place in order to have this impact.
Hey, thanks again, Steve. And I honestly should not take the credit for, well, I should say that I was a part of that program and absolutely proud to be part of that. So friends, we talk about policies and programs running in an organization having a huge role to play in getting DE&I embedded as part of the culture or DNA of the organization. Let me share an example from Tata Communications, where I used to be earlier, and where a policy called as LEAP, Life Events Assistance Program, was launched, and with inputs from guess who? The Brandon Hall Group. Now, this company studied the attrition data, and especially for women's attrition, and identified that there were peaks at certain stages. Now, these points of inflection as such, for example, are someone getting married or going for a maternity break or returning from a mat break. So the company identified these points of inflection and actionables at each stage. For example, supporting employees by assuring them of their roles upon their return, supporting business managers by sponsoring contractual resources for the duration of the break for the employee, and providing even psychological support with counselors while respecting the confidentiality of these meetings. Lastly, coaching and mentoring of business managers on do's and don'ts when dealing with these situations. Now, if you see the annual report of the company, you would notice a proud mention of the number of awards that they have won. So whether it is best employer or great places to work or best companies for women or Business World and Ask Insight's global DE&I award, I think this, whatever has been achieved, it reflects in the ESAT and all these surveys. run on employees. And this is something I thought I would love to share with you all. Steve, back to you.
Ashish, thank you. Everyone, these strategies can work. They do work. They have worked for organizations, and they can work for yours as well. And I want to share one more strategy. So 2 more slides, then we can get to some questions. And this last strategy today is about how to address internal career development in a way that's going to boost inclusion in your organization. And that's by offering these services based on skills, making them self-service, and making them transparent for all employees. So there are a number of different career services that organizations can and really should offer to their employees. And we have here a representative list of what those services are on the right. Things such as career planning, L&D, mentorship, upskilling, reskilling, and so forth. You may define your list of career services differently, which is fine. This is a representative list because the approaches that matter would be the same across all of these services. You can prevent bias and reach the outcomes you're looking for by basing those services on individual capabilities, by enabling self-service, and by being transparent. And the reasons why that work are all the reasons we see on the right. You make it self-service, you make it one policy for all employees so that employees can't go around it. That means that somebody who's shy about asking for a new opportunity is going to have an equal shot as someone who's a self-promoter. Someone who is really good at networking with executives has the same shot as somebody who does not have the time to do that. Somebody who has all of the family advantages, went to a fancy college, should have no greater ability to advance the organization than somebody who is the first person in their family to go to college, the person who has young kids at home, who has a busy life. That person ought to have the same opportunity. And by creating one policy that employees can't go around, self-service, you make that possible. I want to talk a little further as well about skills. Because when you're using skills, or which we often call capabilities at Eightfold, you are providing transparency to offer the kinds of services listed here. You're making it transparent. You're personalizing it to each employee and telling that employee, here is how this company makes a decision about how someone advances their career. Here is how you can do it. You're not being forced to raise your hand. You don't need to do something different if you don't want to. But if you do want to, we're going to use this information to make the decision, and we're going to apply this decision criteria to everybody. And if you have the potential, you can advance. If you're a member of an underrepresented group who is not represented in our C-suite today, that's something that you're going to be aware of. But if you see information in this way based on skills and not biases, you're going to see that you can get there someday. You have everything to gain and your employer supports you. And it's this fundamental shift, making options based on capabilities rather than biases and making them self-service. That is what is going to break through within organizations and create this aspect of inclusion that really matters. This is how we're going to change some of these numbers, like what I showed at the beginning of this webinar, and change them quickly. Everyone has the right to breathe. Claude, I believe you wanted to add an additional comment here as well?
Well, just real quick, and you want to get to questions, but this is a great example where DE&I strategy is not separate from the rest of human capital management. That, you know, self-service and the ability to choose is also an incredibly helpful strategy in all areas of human capital management, from career planning, you know, having learning that's personalized and contextualized, and a lot of other areas. So this is a great example of something that's focused in the way Steve's talking about it on DE&I, but it's just a good strategy, period. And there's a lot of those strategies that we have that can be applied to and can have an impact on DE&I. It's not, you know, it's not always segregated. This is a good example of that.
That's right. This comes back to some of the findings from McKinsey and Company and others that have studied this. Doing the right things for diversity, equity, and inclusion is good business practice. It's good for profitability. It's good for your competitive advantage. Well, we'd love to hear more questions from you. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Claude.
Yeah, well, let's start with a couple on anonymous screening, and then we'll try to hit some others. So here's one. It's a statement and a question. So anonymous screening sounds good in theory, but isn't it also promoting erasure of people's identities? Isn't the real issue that we should be aware of and work on our unconscious bias, as opposed to making tools that make it easier to eliminate what makes someone who they are? It feels a bit like color blindness to me. Have you considered this? You want to tackle that? I can try it.
What I want to say for that is that we want to reduce bias and then use equity policy to create that positive move toward increasing representation. So if you pair equity policy with unbiased screening process, I think you end up with the outcome that you're going to look for in increasing that representation. Claude, did you want to add on to that topic? It's a great question.
No, I was gonna move on to another one. It's similar. The background of the question is similar, but in the end, the question is, how does Eightfold ensure hiring teams hire for culture add? In other words, those who align to the values but are additive to the team, increasing diversity and from an inclusive lens.
I apologize, Claude. I'm not sure I understood that question. Could you repeat it?
Yeah, I think what she's getting at is that anonymous screening is great, but it doesn't eliminate initial. It may help reduce initial bias, but it doesn't ensure equity in the process. And so, how do you go about ensuring that when you're eliminating identity?
I think I would love, Ashish, if you also have some thoughts on this topic from
Sure.
your background executing these programs. I think that if you're pairing the anonymous screening with the ability to measure and use those analytics in real time, you can look to see if certain parts of your processes are leading toward an outcome that you're not looking for. Culture is one of those loaded words because we often see evidence that talk about culture is in fact creating a bias. And I'm not saying that that's what the questioner intended by the use of the word culture, but I often think we want to move away from thinking about culture and really focus on capability of the individual.
Yes, and I totally agree with that, Steve. The fact is that companies in the future will be hiring for capabilities and less on skills. Why? Because you would see in so many surveys and feedback from the topmost consulting firms that the jobs for the year 2030, at least 70% of them are yet to be invented. So if those jobs are not known, what about the skills, right? So clearly, people will be hiring for capabilities, and capabilities will have to go beyond, D&I, right? This has to be part of the DNA of an organization, that the best fit for the role, and also especially from, underrepresented groups from the society have a very fair chance at those roles. And clearly, the companies' policies and their programs, they have a huge role to play in getting people to the desired state.
Okay, we just have a couple minutes. I don't want to run away from the tough questions either. We got one about people wondering, or at least one person wondering, about our decision of choosing presenters that are speaking today around DE&I. That all three of us seem to be white presenting older men. Did we consider a more diverse panel of experts in this conversation? So I'll talk to that. So first of all, from a gender standpoint, certainly we thought about it, and perhaps we could have had more gender diversity. In terms of other types of diversity, it's not always the way it looks. I happen to be born in Brazil, parents from Brazil and Germany. My father is Jewish and fled Nazi Germany, and then ended up serving in World War II on the American side. And I'm also of mixed religion, Catholic and Jewish. So sometimes the level of diversity, and of course, Ashish is from India, so we have another type of diversity. I also think that, and it's certainly a legitimate question, but that men talking about some of these issues, including white men, and showing allyship for the level of diversity and inclusion that should be in all our organizations is a good thing, not necessarily a bad thing. But I do appreciate the question, and I didn't want to not answer it on the air. I don't know if anybody has anything else they want to add.
Well, I think that's great, Claude. We want to make sure that everybody is comfortable addressing this issue. After all, we're not going to fix the challenges we see around diversity, equity, and inclusion unless everybody is involved in fixing the issue.
If I may just add a small line, what makes me proud is when after a webinar of this nature, you get someone's invite on LinkedIn already saying that we saw you on the webinar and thought that there were 2 cents that could be added. So well, thank you so much, friends.
Yep, thank you. We have some other questions I'd love to get to. There was a really good one about gender diversity that I'd love to comment on. Maybe we can do that offline. I want to thank Steve and Ashish and Eightfold for sponsoring this. I think we've had some really good strategies and some good discussion. Thank you for your attention and your interest in this topic. Brandon Hall Group is having other DE&I webinars in the coming weeks that we hope some of you will also attend. So thank you. Thanks for your time. Thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of the day.